Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this very special webinar organized by the Coup Policy Institute, which is a think tank at the Dennis and Minora Forotia Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you all join us for discussions on the September 5th coup d'etat in Guinea-Conakry and its impact on democracy and governance in Africa. Moderating this session is the Executive Chairman of the Coup Policy Institute, Dr. Dennis Forotia. He has with him very distinguished panelists, and please, as we unfold in the course of these discussions, feel free to interact with panelists and other participants via the chat box. Send in your questions via the Q&A box. Dr. Dennis, you are welcome, sir, to kickstart discussions for today.
Thank you very much, Noella, for that. I'm Dennis Forotia. I'm the Executive Chair of Coup Policy Institute, and it's a great honor to be moderating this distinguished panel today. As we know, over the past 15 years, there's been real significant backsliding regarding the trends in democracy across sub-Saharan Africa. Just this year, or within the last 12 months, there have been 3 coups d'etats in Africa, mostly in Central West Africa. A double coup d'etat in Mali, a coup d'etat in Chad, a military takeover in Chad, and then recently, just on last Sunday, a coup d'etat in Guinea-Conakry. And it's under this context that we are here today to examine this unfortunate trend that we see and look at its implications for the continent as a whole. Today, we are joined by 3 very renowned experts in the field of democracy and good governance. First is Ms. Hidayat Hassan. Hidayat is the Executive Director of the Center for Democracy and Development, which is based in Abuja. The think tank, which is focused on deepening democracy and development in West Africa. She was previously the Principal Program Officer and Team Leader for Democratic Governance Unit of the organization. We are also joined by Jeffrey Smith. Jeff is the Executive Director of Vanguard Africa, which is really involved in promoting democracy across Africa, has been involved in many pro-democracy movements on the continent. He has done a lot of research work in Africa. Previously, he worked with the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Institute, Freedom House, National Endowment for Democracy, Institute for Democratic Alternatives in South Africa, as well as UNESCO. So Jeff, thank you very much for that. Also joining us on this panel is Franklin Cudjoe. Franklin is well known as a major think tank leader across the continent. Franklin is the founding president and chief executive officer of Imani Ghana, Imani Center for Policy and Education, which is a very reputable think tank, one of the leading think tanks in Africa. He has been, Imani has been consistently ranked as one of the top think tanks in sub-Saharan Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this panel on this very important discussion. Well, I will start with Hidayat. Hidayat, welcome. Let me start with you. Just in a few minutes or so, what is your quick take, your overview as to this development in Guinea, this military takeover in Guinea? What is your quick read of the situation?
Well, thank you very much. I think that this are quite interesting time for us on the continent, and particularly in Central and West Africa, where there is so much that binds us together. You could almost say that even though we have a lot of ethnicity, our politics, our culture are almost the same, and that's how we've actually intermingled. So this is a big, representing the 3rd coup d'etat within 1 year. And this recent one in Guinea is instructive because it's telling us that in an area where elections, periodic elections are now the norm, no longer an exception. We are not talking about the quality of those elections, but the fact that it is actually held to tick the box. It's good. It's a bad decision. It's a bad development. And especially when you look at the indexes from our Afrobarometer, it also tells us that everybody here wants democracy, unlike other parts of the world where there is actually few demands for democracy. So what has actually happened, it's something that should make everybody worry, not just in Guinea, but here in Nigeria, Ghana, and all the countries, with the Gambian elections being the most recent and forthcoming in a couple of months. But there are very important things we should actually look and learn from all these three coup d'etat so that we can actually know where to go from. One very important trend to note is that it's all linked to contentious elections. And historically, contentious elections has been one which putschists across the continent has used as a basis to intervene in government, of course, adding corruption to this issue. So from Deby to Mali and to Guinea, elections is in it. Two, importantly, is the fact that citizens welcomed all this change in government, the push. In Bamako, seeing people trooping out, shouting and dancing liberté, screaming that is also instructive and is not different from what actually happened in Mali or in Chad. In fact, Mali is more worrying. Heard that we saw our colleagues, analysts, also saying that even the putschists can stay for quite some time so that they can actually restrain law and order into this society. Now, third and very important point that we also need to look at is this important trend of who are the people overthrowing this government. In all the three countries, which Guinea help us to further cement, is the role of foreign trained military men. But we've so much focused on these foreign trained military men, blaming it at the military themselves, without situating it within the context of what these elite forces have actually done in our region. When you avert yourself to these elite forces, they've been more interested in regime security rather than national security. And it even goes back to Burkina Faso, where we saw the regimental, the RSP in 2015, again attempted to scuttle elections before the people stood against them. But it's not just the story about the foreign, these foreign trained men that are important, but the role of foreign governments in most of this. While this coup d'etat has taken place, the curfew imposed in Guinea-Conakry does not affect businesses, in particular mining. Who owns the business climate in those countries? China, Russia. So their interests are not taken out. Then you take a 360 look and you look at what has happened either with Chad or Mali. The putschists in Mali, at every point in time in the first 2 weeks of the coup d'etat, actually put up pictures of the people, of all the foreign governments as they visited them on Twitter. So what can ECOWAS or the African Union possibly do? And of course, we saw President Macron fly into N'Djamena, and even President Buhari of Nigeria welcomed the son of Idris Deby to Nigeria. This was really more about national interests, not about continental interests. And these are worrying trends for us. And I think in conclusion, what we should know is that two things are gradually happening on the continent, and in particular with West and Central Africa. One, which we have actually said to be the constitutional coup d'etat, that you do not have to come by the force of gun. All just you have to do is to change the constitution and you keep yourself there, either as totemism. But either you come in through this way, they've also shown us these three manipulation of laws, either electoral laws or processes or change of constitution, have also shown a trend that it is bringing the putschists back into the office, and they are sending those constitutional coupists out to the gun, really. Yeah. Thank you very much.
No, I appreciate that, Idayat, very much. I think it's very instructive, and the fact that, as you mentioned, elections right now are being held to tick the box. That, as you said, being held to tick the box. And I think for a while now, that's been a constant refrain from a lot of analysts and people who look into elections in Africa. And the fact that you highlighted three very important points: the contentious elections that we have, the fact that citizens actually surprisingly also do welcome some of these military coups, and the fact that who are those leading the coups. Now, Jeff, you've been very involved with movements, pro-democracy movements across the continent. You recently in Zambia, we saw pretty much a very good signal of what we thought were the trends, with the opposition leader actually winning, and the incumbent president ceding and having a very peaceful, very nice democratic transition. But here we are, being the entire continent being seen from the light of the coup. What is your quick take regarding the lessons from this coup and what is even driving it?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's always a difficult proposition to speak after Idaya, because she always explains things so thoroughly and so concisely. When she's talking about the fact that the demands for democracy remain in Guinea and across the region, the fact that these military takeovers are often very much inherently linked to contested or otherwise rigged elections, and the ineffective roles of foreign governments and foreign partners. So those are some of the issues that initially came to mind for me today when I was thinking about this event, but several others. And just really quickly, what really struck me when all this happened last weekend is just thinking about former President Condé and the disappointment in the fall from grace, the very rapid fall from grace that we saw from him. We have to remember that, he was in the political opposition for decades. He was an ardent activist and supporter of democracy and multi-party elections because of his work, because of his human rights activism. He was in exile in France, where he actually was a professor of human rights, if you can believe that. And he was widely seen as a main driver behind Guinea's multi-party democracy, which ironically is now in danger due to his actions that he took as president. So that's really the first issue that came to mind for me, is just wrapping my head around that. And perhaps that's linked to the issue of, we often have a tendency, including here in Washington, D.C., where I currently am, is to sort of lionize the opposition. And when they come to power, we sort of overlook their flaws and many of the actions they take to erode democracy when they ultimately get to power. Secondly, the big issue for me is, until recently, ECOWAS, or the West African region, was on average the most democratic region on the continent by far and away. To my mind, it had surpassed the Southern African Development Community. But from about 2017, 2018 onward, it's been the fastest eroding. And you look at the research from Freedom House, for instance, in 2019, they noted that West Africa was actually the fastest backsliding region on the entire continent. So now it's a region of huge contrast, right? We have countries that remain very strong democracies in Ghana and in Senegal, Cabo Verde, certainly, but also is a region that has countries that are effectively now run by the military or military regimes. We often forget about Togo. It's a military dictatorship that's been in power for decades. And of course, Mali, which we've discussed a bit, and certainly Guinea now. But then there's also countries that are rapidly backsliding. So countries that used to be perceived, and rightly so, as strong and emerging democracies, but are now falling back very rapidly. You look at Benin and the essential outlawing of the political opposition there, Cote d'Ivoire, where third termism is evident. And one could also, Nigeria, right? One of the most important countries on the continent, rapidly backsliding across the board on political freedoms and civil liberties. And the third key issue, and I hope we can unpack this a bit today, is, and Idea sort of referenced this, is Conde's overthrow. To me, this really was a foreseeable outcome of his autocratic overreach and of eroding democratic norms that we've seen in Guinea, but also across the region. And this included, of course, the amending of the constitution that allowed him to run for a third term. So the coup in Guinea that we witnessed, and now that we're experiencing the aftershocks of that ensuing instability and the long-term consequences that there will be, this could have been avoided if both the regional and the international community, to be honest, had stood up first to, number one, counter the illegal alteration of the constitution, and secondly, to prevent and respond to the blatant rigging of the October 2020 election that was documented and it was readily apparent at the time. This was an election that included violence, the intimidation of opposition voters, the late opening of voting stations and opposition strongholds, the barring of opposition agents from polling stations in the count. We saw internet and telephone network shutdowns, and of course, mass result reconciliation irregularities. So long story short, and just to wrap up, I think it was really the inaction and apathy on the part of international partners and institutions, including regional leaders. This has resulted in a situation that will have far more destabilizing effects than any attempt to stand up for the forces of democracy might have had in the first place.
Yeah, no, fully in agreement there, Jeff. And I think that's really on point about the whole third termism issue. The fact that Conde, like Alassane Ouattara, said, they believe that they are the only ones who could govern, who could run the country. You need to have a certain degree of narcissism to actually believe that it's you or nobody else. So, but unfortunately, that's where we are now. Franklin, you have been very vocal on this issue way before. I mean, Imani wrote many pieces regarding the democratic or the autocratic tendency of the Conde regime and what he was doing. I think even back in April, March of last year or so. Now, from where you sit, what is your overview of the situation?
Well, thanks again for having me, and good greetings to everybody. Look, we launched something we call the Shades of Conde, a website which I think is a bit defunct right now. But essentially, we were cataloging some of the very inane, arcane infractions that he had started sowing immediately he became president. And we're not surprised, from the politics to the economy to social issues. It was all Conde, and we were not entirely, as I said, not surprised that eventually he's been overthrown. Not that we like the coup. I mean, I don't think we rejoice because coups are not necessarily the paths for, should I call them, civilized paths for changing government. But as you heard the commander of the coup say, that the military is supposed to protect the country. So it gets to a point where if a leader's infractions are cataloged in such a way that they present or they mimic a pattern of elite capture or state capture of resources, as well as even the collective minds of people, it makes it difficult for people to think freely. And so it's been long coming. Some of us are not surprised, as I said. And I think that the challenge has also been the case that the ECOWAS regional body, which is supposed to superintend some of these, at least act as a watchdog against some of these orchestrated infractions, have been quite sleepy. I mean, if you notice that our own president, who happens to be the chairman of the ECOWAS, actually sent congratulatory messages to the Conde when he decided to break the constitutional term limit, right? And recently I was asking the question, so what did West African regional leaders tell Conde when he won the election? And what are they telling him now? It sort of makes a mockery of the call on the military junta to, as it were, immediately return power to civilians. Ordinarily, that's a sensible thing to ask. But could all this have been avoided? The answer obviously is yes. I mean, to think that we've been told that the ECOWAS regional body is now suspending Guinea, it's like playing to the rule book, and it has been the same actions that the ECOWAS regional body has taken anytime there's been some sort of military incursions or overthrow, a coup d'etat in any part of the region. So I put all of this down to the whole idea of presidential term limits that are being toyed with right now, purposely to capture the state and its resources. There's nothing else about it. Of course, there are always the indicators, as Idat and Jeffrey have mentioned. But it looks to me that while the rest of the continent is now looking at trying to grow their economies, it appears we are leaving our people behind with this last vestiges of what I call state capture.
Yeah, so Franklin, very much appreciate that. Now there is this concern that I have, which I don't know if the leaders, when you say like ECOWAS leaders or so, or for the greater part African Union leaders, it almost appears to me as though they are on a path of collective suicide, believing that what is happening to their neighbors will not happen to them. And even as you said, even what Nana, president of Ghana, sending congratulatory messages to Condé after he rigged the election. Now, Idayat, what is, from your vantage point, what do you think needs to happen at the ECOWAS level and at the AU level? And do you think whatever it is that you think needs to happen, do you think it can happen?
I actually think it might be very difficult to happen, because there is a lack of proper understanding of what the problem really is by the leaders. And the first question we need to ask ourselves is that, who are the leaders, and how are the states actually in ECOWAS states, how are they faring? You just take a look. You look at Togo, Guinea-Bissau, Nigeria, Mali, Benin, Cote d'Ivoire, and a host of others. Who are those leaders? And what is the quality of democracy being enjoyed in those countries? And it's this same set of people who make up the leadership of ECOWAS. So how will they be able to push for a change? I think that's the one we've not really been able to benchmark. What happened in the last 20 years when we had the likes of Obasanjo in ECOWAS, even when we had the Tanja crisis in Niger, we saw how it was readily addressed. Even in 2012, Mali and Guinea, and in Guinea-Bissau in 2012, the putsch, how everything was actually handled. It's now becoming impossible for that to happen because of the quality of the leadership. And I think I'll signpost one thing where ECOWAS continues to be very weak, due to no fault of themselves. So when the Guinea-Bissau elections became contested, ECOWAS followed all the processes the same way they did with in Guinea-Conakry, actually, especially with the pertaining to the voters register. But for Guinea-Bissau in particular, they refused to recognize Embalo for quite some time. But what happened? Embalo went to visit Macky Sall. From Macky Sall, he went to visit Issoufou in Niger. From Niger, he came to Nigeria. And President Buhari also welcomed him as the substantive leader of Guinea-Bissau. What role can ECOWAS at that point play to not duly recognize this person? So the crop of leadership that we have currently are not able to deal with these issues the way it should actually be dealt with. And when we talk about the African Union, is it not in the same country? So the current chairman of African Union, or whatever, the Mahamat Faki, for instance, is a Chadian. But he is from a country where it's actually being ruled in khaki had the moment not ruled through democratic means. So the issue of legitimacy, the issue of lack of support, even if there is actually a functional secretariat, beginning to pop up at every point in time, which tells us that we have to go back to the citizenry and start focusing on one, empowering the citizenry, two, strengthening civil society like what Jeffrey actually does, and building solidarity. One place I discovered how difficult it is to build solidarity was in Mali and Guinea Conakry last year. When I first joined CDD and we have issues like this, in a twinkling of an eye, you can do a press statement, you can call meetings without money, you can get people right there on ground. But with monies, of course, COVID could not allow people to go up to Conakry. Eventually, a mission was sent. But secondly, to even get people to sign on a solidarity statement was so difficult because people had what they felt was no longer working or different challenges. And we have to go back to the box and start rethinking this if we want to look for concrete in terms of addressing these challenges we currently grapple with.
Well, I think you're very on the money regarding the crop of leadership, because I think at the moment, if you were to look at leaders across the continent today, it would be very difficult for you to identify up to 5 very principled leaders across the continent. So it's a major issue. And now, Jeff, a couple of things that you highlighted. One is obviously opposition. But what Ida had also mentioned is the fact that it almost seems as though we have to go back to the drawing board or as to where the citizens, have the power, because we do see the fact that citizens do not like, obviously, a constitutional coup like our civilian leaders, have been perpetrated. They welcome a change of a military coup, but obviously we know that they are against the military coup as well. So at the end of the day, how do we, from your experience with this movement building or so, how do we move forward, in a situation like this that is so, it's hard to really figure out a way to make progress?
Yeah, those are such incredibly important points, especially the aspect of empowering the citizenry and building solidarity and taking the view away from the problematic leaders that we have and perhaps looking at the population that really matters, and that's the citizens, right, in these countries. In Guinea, for example, I mentioned this at the outset. If you look at all the available public survey data, according to Afrobarometer, for example, more than 8 out of 10 citizens in Guinea favor a 2-term limit on presidential mandates. And this is a reminder that citizens of Guinea strongly prefer democracy, right? They prefer term limits and they want free and fair elections. They're demanding that. It's the supply side that has been lacking, not the demand side. And these preferences are also widespread across the region. So this is an important counterpoint to those who somehow falsely claim often that these democratic values and principles are somehow imposed from the outside, which is clearly not the case. And according to the same survey that I just referenced from Afrobarometer, if you look at that same poll, that same Afrobarometer poll, more than 70% at the time of Guineans disapprove of single party rule, one man rule, and military rule, saying that democracy is most preferable. So I think we have to remind ourselves that those demands, those citizen demands are there. It's just a matter of standing behind them and standing alongside them and building that solidarity to push forward these aspirations and what seems to be the general will of the people. Now, I think to the point that was just raised, I clearly fundamentally believe that Africa's regional bodies and international partners as well, being from the vantage point that I'm at, we need to act more decisively to both anticipate and respond to what seems to be an alarming trend in the region. We've discussed Mali, we've discussed Chad, and we have to remember that this is now the 3rd coup in Guinea's history since achieving independence in 1958. So how do we do that? Number one, I think first and foremost, we have to confront very evident democratic backsliding. I mentioned at the outset that according to Freedom House, West Africa suffered the fastest decline in political rights and civil liberties from 2019 onward. However, what has happened? Guinea's partners continue to prioritize other issues, right? They have prioritized counterterrorism and strategic major power competition with China and Russia over democracy promotion and in spite of democracy. So this democratic regression, the flawed and rigged elections we've seen in Guinea, the extension of term limits, the endemic corruption that was on the rise, this provided the pretext for the soldiers to use military action to take over. I think we must not lose sight of that. That's a key point here. And the paradox here is that military officers in Guinea, and if you look to Zimbabwe in 2017, right, the soldiers come to power co-opting the will of the people. And in a sense, rejecting the will of the people, but they cloak their hostile takeover as reflective of people's aspirations, often in the aftermath of rigged elections and rigged constitutions. Almost always, though, we have to remind ourselves of this as well, because we've heard, the coup leaders in Conakry saying that they've done this as a patriotic act. They're doing this for the benefit of the country. We heard that same language from President Mnangagwa in Zimbabwe in 2017 and 2018, and look what has happened there. We talked to many activists in Zimbabwe, many civil society leaders, and certainly those in the political opposition, and they'll say what they've experienced over the past 3+ years has been worse than they could have ever imagined, and arguably worse than what transpired during the Mugabe era, which was, one of the most ruthless dictatorships in all of Africa. So the role played by international institutions, and this includes the US, certainly, this includes the African Union, this includes the West African Regional Bloc, it's been problematic. And the larger point here is, I think, under the guise of, and I'll put this in quotations, of stability, the regional and international community has turned a blind eye, and they allowed Condé to run roughshod over democratic norms and violently assume a third term. Ironically, the country is now faced, and we are now faced collectively with the very instability we were ostensibly trying to prevent. So it's this flawed sort of logic that we keep perpetuating year after year, decade after decade, that is, for me personally, very frustrating, and particularly given the work that we do with citizens and helping to build solidarity. I think we just need a major intellectual overhaul in how we look at these issues, because as Franklin was saying, what happened in Guinea was avoidable, but it was also entirely predictable. He and others, we've been writing about this for 3+ years now, when Condé, going back to 2018, sacked the chief judge in the country so he could then elongate his term and push through his unconstitutional third term. So we all saw this coming, or I shouldn't say we all. Those of us concerned with these issues saw this coming. It just didn't resonate to the top, where some of the recommendations that have been put in place years ago weren't followed, and here we are today talking about this issue. It's very, very frustrating, and that's why I think we just need an immediate overhaul and rethinking of this. And perhaps I'm biased because I'm currently here in Washington, D.C., but perhaps President Biden's upcoming summit on democracies might be a venue in which we can start discussing these issues that aren't just affecting West Africa, and they aren't just affecting Guinea, they're affecting the world right now. We're witnessing a profound democratic regression across the globe, and I think we need to start confronting these issues more strategically and more forward-looking, to be sure.
Yeah, so I mean, I do believe, and I agree with you, Jeff, that it seems as though the leadership at the very high executive level is very transactional now. Like all the overwhelming principles that should guide decision making at the highest executive level is being relegated to very little or few transactions, national transactions, whether it's bilateral transactions or so. That is really undermining, the future of a big section of the cross section of the continent. Now, there are two things that I want to highlight, and Franklin, come to you. One is, we know that people like Condé were, let me say, were in the past Democrats. They fought for human rights. They did all of the things that you expect the real opposition to do, and folks who are democratic promoters to be doing. We know of recently in Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani. Ashraf Ghani is the same boat. I mean, people who have fought for years for democracy, but once they get into power, you know, they get, whether it's captured or the power captures them, one of the two. But it's this thing of the personalization of power, where, you know, it's not a system, it's not an institution, but it's an individual. That's one thing. The second thing I want to bring for your comment, frankly, is the whole notion of the investment from the international community and international partners on this, you know, security issues. You know, look at the amount of money that is pummeled into the Sahel region, and or whether it was in Afghanistan, and it perpetrates this, you know, significant corruption without any checks and balances or so. Now, can you comment on those two things, the lack of institution and the personalization of power in many of these countries, as well as this involvement of international players from a security, you know, nexus, and how that may be contributing to what we see today?
Well, first of all, I mean, one of the basic tenets of democracy, obviously, is that once you subscribe to the rules of the game, then somehow, once you get elected, you're supposed to play by the rule. Unfortunately, it looks as if the alley of power, especially in this part of our world, tends to become so powerful that some people even perceive that power is synonymous to the devil's, should I say, acts, and that people who automatically become pariah to what they themselves professed have become the devil incarnate themselves. First of all, I do not necessarily agree with that particular analogy at all. I think it's just personal beliefs and personal behaviors which are far from one's true character or one's true north. Indeed, I mean, once you come into power, you obviously, before you came to power, you are proposing to burden the people's livelihoods that have become like catastrophic. Now, it presupposes that you have a set of values as well as a set of principles and a set of people that you rule the country with. But the moment you come in and then you appoint yes men, that is the beginning of your undoing. I've always said that there's no paucity of, or there's no shortage of skilled persons on the continent. In every regime, in every country, you have skilled people that can be co-opted into any administration at all for effective governance. But the moment you come into power and you surround yourself with yes men, that's the beginning of the loss of your own principles. And I think that this actually typifies Condé. I mean, Condé decided that, well, he wasn't going to listen to anybody, including his friends who are outside of the country. But I know a Ghanaian diplomat who just 2 months ago actually visited Condé and discussed with Condé that when the applause is loudest, maybe that's when you should leave the scene. He never did. In fact, one, I've forgotten where it comes from, but an African intellectual, Adama Gay, knows Condé very well and has described his decisions as crazy because he thought Condé had departed from the principles that guided them when they were young men in Paris. So somehow it's a reflection of how a person's persona obviously gets eroded immediately when he assumes a position that he believes can only be sustained by surrounding himself with people who are pliant. For me, that's the way I see it. The second question regarding the interference or otherwise of outside factors, you know, like you remember the story of the Greeks. Is that I've forgotten the particular story. I think it has to do with Helen of Troy. Remember when the Trojan horse was the Trojan horse analogy, where basically Greece was a country that was in turmoil. And the only reason why outsiders were able to come in and obviously derail its efforts or its development was because when they were quarreling among themselves, outsiders were watching. So for me, if you run your country in such a way that you you disempower the ordinary citizen as well as the institutions that are supposed to basically protect the country. Then you have agent provocateurs who definitely are lying around, who take advantage of situations like that. And don't forget that the Sahelian region obviously is quite soaked with all sorts of rebel activity, insurgents all over, remnants from the Libyan war and all of that stuff. So it was just a matter of time that in spite of the investments that were being made in order to protect the region, the Sahelian region against or countries like Guinea against the incursions from the Sahel, it was just a matter of time that these things were going to happen anyway. And for me, much as I like to blame some Western construct or some, I like to call them not necessarily conspiratorial. I think it's real, but I think it is the nature of governance, it is the way leaders behave that automatically attract this interest. And once, as I said, your people who are closest to you, whose advice you are not taking, it means you have opened up yourself for any form of advice. And that could include Western conspirators, conspiracy, should I say, people who dwell on conspiracy and as well dwell on just dismembering countries that they think are fragile.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that at the end of the day, there has to be these checks and balances internally, because unfortunately, most of our presidents or so are super powerful to the point where obviously Conde was able to sack the Supreme Court, justice and things like that. Now, as there've been many questions coming in. And as we look to wrap up and figure out, obviously, from the trends that we are seeing, it will not be surprising that another coup d'etat happens somewhere on the continent. I mean, there is so much discord in many countries. Cameroon, for example, where there is opposition and the elections and the electoral process totally disregarded. So it will not be surprising that many of these countries continue to have we continue to see military coups. Now there's one question from Francis: why is the international community more offended in the military and not the civilian coup d'etat? I think we talked about that before, but Hidayat, as we look to wrap up, where do we really go from here? What are we? It almost seems as though this happens, we talk about it, and then it happens again. But I think, Jeff, I'll have you coming right now for now.
Yeah, I think there's a number of steps that can be taken moving forward. I think, and this has been alluded to as well, the weak and ineffectual response from the region, from ECOWAS. I think, there needs to be applied meaningful pressure and sanctions for such unconstitutional actions. And I think Africa's regional bodies and again, international partners, they're part of the blame too. They've been weak when responding to military coups. They'll initially, put in place economic sanctions or temporary suspensions, but inevitably they'll be quickly lifted. Of course, ECOWAS has suspended Guinea, but has so far not applied any sanctions. And this is inherently related to the issue I brought up in my previous remarks. Insofar as democracy and respect for democratic values and institutions, they're almost always subverted by other seeming priorities. And I think it's this leniency and this, really apparent inability to strategize beyond the immediate term. This has enabled coup leaders to make minimal concessions. To your point, Dennis, we see this happening over and over again. They make minimal concessions, and all the while they're preparing for longer stays in power. The region, West Africa specifically, is its history is replete with leaders who have done so. I think back to July 1994, when a young military colonel in Banjul overthrew an elected government there and said, I'm doing this on behalf of the will of people, and I will cede power once we have free and fair elections. And, you know, that was Yahya Jammeh, and he was in power for 23 years up until December 2016 when the people bravely voted him out. So I think, you know, the costs right now as it stands are simply, they're not high enough. And the coup leaders in Guinea clearly saw this, and they've banked on this fact. And I think, you know, not to belabor the point, but I really think it bears repeating. We just really need a rethink and a refocus. First and foremost, and fundamentally, a healthy democracy is essential for boosting a country's development, human development, and security outcomes. And importantly, again, going back to the people, the data shows, according to all available polling and surveys, that citizens across Africa understand this fact. And I think that this should set the policy foundation. Number one, doing so would base policy on principle, on reason, and at the same time reflect the general will and aspirations of citizens across Africa, including in Guinea. And I think it's also important to add that I think there are other key measures that we can take or start to look at a bit more. You know, when we're talking about elections as simply just ticking the boxes and going through the motions now, what we need is active observer missions with a clear mandate to call out electoral malfeasance and rigging, which we saw in Guinea in October 2020, which served as the pretext for the coup leaders to overthrow now deposed President Condé. And again, this isn't being imposed from the outside. This isn't coming from the West. These are in line with regional and international standards. We have to remind ourselves that a so-called peaceful election is not free and fair elections. I think there needs to be diplomatic engagement with muscle and clear red lines. I think this, for example, could have helped counter the role of Russia, which we haven't talked about today, which was arguably Condé's biggest international backer, right? So what we do not need is lip service and hollow statements. So to wrap up, inaction and weakness led to the coup in Guinea. And so often the rationale for turning a blind eye to what we saw as very clear steps towards this happening was to secure so-called stability. This is disingenuous. It's contrary to the logic and available data. And by turning a blind eye and exercising weakness, as was very clearly the case in Guinea, we inevitably plant the seeds for further instability and rob Guineans of their express will and preferences. And just as a final statement, I think the mistakes in Guinea really, right now, we need to be talking about this. It should serve as a stark warning for regional and international players for upcoming elections. It raised Gambia, the upcoming elections in Gambia in December, in Kenya, as well as Mali and Zimbabwe in 2023, both of which experienced military coups. As a counterpoint and as maybe a glimmer of hope for ECOWAS, you know, I think Gambia serves as an interesting counterpoint. In December 2016, we all remember that ECOWAS stood strong. They helped force then President Jammeh out. Regional international leaders aligned with the local population to secure a democratic transition in that attempted electoral coup when Jammeh refused to leave power. So the region has, you know, imposed its will before. But with recent experiences, you know, certainly in Chad and in Mali and twice in Mali and now in Guinea, it definitely does paint a dark cloud. But I think these are some of the logical steps that we can take that, again, are in line with the preferences and aspirations of citizens on the ground. And I think that needs to be the focus, not necessarily the leaders who remain in power, the problematic leaders who remain in power. Too often we conflate the state with the leader who's in charge, and we often lose sight of the people who are demanding these things. It's the supply side that has been lacking, and I think there's a lot we can do to help support that.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, and we also have to remember that leadership does matter. You know, when we talk about Jammeh in 2016, we cannot forget that the AU chairperson at the time was the South African Zuma. And it was very telling because ECOWAS actually followed Zuma, because within 24 hours, there was a very strong statement from her regarding how this wasn't going to, like, you know, stand. And I think the lack of that leadership at the very highest level is leading to this deterioration that we are seeing across the board. Now, Franklin, one thing that Jeff had mentioned earlier is, you know, we see, for example, in Zambia, where there is an opposition person who comes into play, but similar to in 2010, when opposition leader Condé came into power. there is this issue of, us glossing over when the opposition transitions from being the opposition to being in leadership. So from your experience in Ghana, where there is a very robust opposition, what is it that you can draw from Ghana as for us to learn, or for that should be upheld in all of these other places where there are glimmers of hope regarding a possible democracy? What is it? And then second question to you, what do you see as the future specifically in the next couple of months for Guinea?
Well, first of all, Ghana has had a fair share of coups. As you recall, I think we've had about 10 coups since independence, but we've also had 7 back-to-back elections successfully held. And all points to the power of the relative political parties, either in opposition or in government. And I think largely is the vigilance of the people that matter. Our peculiar case in Ghana was essentially protecting the ballot box so that the ballot boxes were not going to be stuffed with ineligible votes. But it all points to also the fact that the civic groups that were formed in order to enhance Ghana's democratic efforts or journey were quite strong as well. So even though there are still issues, you still find a very active citizenship. So civic space is very strong. And I think for any country that wants to be on the path to perhaps everlasting democracy, if there's anything like that, could mimic some of the things we've done in Ghana. I'm not saying it's all rosy. As you realize, there are always dark clouds and the silver lining. Sorry, there's a silver lining in the dark clouds. So I think there are examples of Ghana clearly on the civics front, which can be adapted. As to what happens from here, I mean, I felt quite sad, and it looks as if it's ominous, by the way, that there could be another coup within the sub-region. Where it will happen, we don't know. I don't think any country or any citizen wants to hear that at all. But unfortunately, it looks as if it's going to get a bit more messy before it becomes better. And this can only be stemmed when people are actively involved in the governance process. I think the challenge has always been the leadership in these countries or in Africa moving far away or moving ahead of the citizenry. And as you were contemplating what exactly is the reason, apart from just elite capture or state capture of resources, I don't know what else would be the cause. So the only advice I would give is that I think we as civil society leaders should continue engaging as much as we can, and so that the opportunities for these otherwise dastardly acts could be nipped in the bud even before they occur.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Idayat, if you are able to make a comment, what do you see as really the way forward in Guinea? And regarding that as well, your concerns or lack thereof for the rest of the sub-region and the continent in general. I think you're muted. Yep,
I think that I'm more concerned about the implication for the continent, because we do know that people learn from bad behaviors. We are all very interested in learning the good and the bad. And when you look at the state of democracy in the region, you find that it's really flailing with citizens complaining. Then when you look also at especially when it comes to democratic rights, but when you match that also with development, you find that most of these countries continue to decline in all the indices that you can think of. Already Central and West Africa boast of 10 out of the country on the lowest development index in the world, the 10 last countries actually in the world. So, and now everybody is complaining. I just saw a new news caption in Nigeria, which stated clearly that Nigerians are no longer asking for the best. They just want to exist. They just want to live. They want to survive. Now, even if it's just to address insecurity, you can't match these two together. More and more people are beginning to call for coup d'etat, especially in a region which is also ridden with conflict. Non-state actors are taking over and governing in these places. So the challenges are immense, and it's worrying that if these putschists are not immediately sent out, we may actually see more of it to come. We may actually see more to come in any country, not just Nigeria, because people are not just Guinea, because of course people compare notes and they are watching. And we should also learn from what has happened in the push. So you saw that in Mali, they never said they took over government. They never used the word coup d'etat. They carefully left it hanging, such that in one way, they were not able to violate the letters of their constitution, really, which made it very difficult for the regional bodies to deal with in the initial days of the coup. It tells you of his sophistication. The second thing they also did in Mali was that they came up with a very poor policy, saying we are going to sell off all the houses, all the cars, all the things politicians do tell us. As you can see, the same in Guinea, where they drove with Alpha Condé into the nooks and crannies of the town so that you can see how people are actually rejoicing. It tells you they are coming up with a playbook, and this playbook it's quite worrying, and it calls for decisive action. It's decisive action, not just from ECOWAS, but really from the African Union and the international community. And I think the second thing we really have to do is the rise of illiberalism in the region. We've not been able to confront that frontally. And we do not, maybe we focus so much on China and with Biden and the Democrats into government, into power. We've been seeing a lot of attempts to regain power, government itself, which further drives people into the hands of them. So it's not only citizens who are looking for cheap Chinese goods, but also government do know that they can circumvent all forms of laws that are in place by being friends with any of these governments. And focus should not just be on China, Russia. We should also think of those new Gulf countries and what they are actually doing on our continent, and in particular in Central and West Africa. These are really, really worrying times. And this is a time that actually call for solidarity, really. A rethinking, a strategic movement, and a leadership from the few remaining leaders of thought who are able to push those people in power currently to see that if we allow the putschists in Guinea to benefit from their push, there will be more of that to happen. And I think my last point, aside from what has been mentioned, is the need for real security sector reform. In most of the countries, particularly in the last decade, there was sector reform because most of the countries were emerging from civil war or even repressive governments. So emphasis was on that. But the kind of security sector reform that we eventually carried out are not fit for purpose. And even in most times, they focused on individuals, not really the institution at stake, and are not forward-looking and adaptive to the kind of situation we have actually found ourselves. So we should prioritize that, while we should never forget accountability itself. This zero-sum politics, where the winner take all, with what is emerging in Gambia, should be something that ensures that we ensure that these December Gambian elections must be gotten right and citizens will prevail. And while Jeffrey and Nick will continue being happy about what happened in Zambia, but to ensure that Zambia does not become another Tanzania or the story of Alpha Condé, whom we discuss today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hidayat, for that. And again, we have to do something about the winner-take-all election. So I'll give Jeff and Franklin 1 minute each to have some closing remarks, please.
Franklin, did you want to?
Right. Well, so clearly speaking, the continent is in the focus again. It's sad because just on the caps of the year 2000, it was built to be the Africa's, should I say, century, right? And there was a lot of hope, some transformative ideas to basically deepening democracy. But there was a poll I saw somewhere, I think 2016, the Africa Report did the poll across the continent. And I think 2/3 of Africans were virtually saying that they preferred development to democracy, however, whatever that meant. It tells you that, look, if people wake up and they do not know where the next meal is coming from, and they feel strongly that the meal has been captured by somebody's action at the official seat of government, then clearly they will definitely revolt. So somehow I suspect that what needs to be done is to emphasize the need for effective development of the continent and its people, so that somehow we'll be able to push away these opportunities that allow these kinds of dastardly acts to occur.
Thank you. Jeff, please.
Yeah, I think just to close out, I think it's really interesting because at the outset of this conversation, we were talking about how West Africa is a region of contrasts, right? And I was struck hearing Franklin talk about his experience in Ghana, because if you look at the coup leader who is now effectively in charge in Guinea, who has he routinely announced in public as his inspiration? You know, it's Jerry Robbins, multiple times. But the contrast to that is, you know, Idea and others brought up the recent success in Zambia. And who was the person behind the scenes who really helped push former President Lungu out the door diplomatically and forcefully was former President of Sierra Leone, Karoma. If it wasn't for him, we might have an entirely different situation unfolding in Zambia right now. So it's really interesting to see those contrasts of leadership and some glimmers of hope, but also some causes for concern. But finally, I think, just to sum up, I think the inability that we've discussed today to support Ghanaian citizens and honestly citizens across the region and the continent, those who are fighting for democracy, quite often putting their lives on the line to do so, and fighting for freedom and dictatorships, what does this do? It only opens the door for more coups, for greater international instability, to be honest. I think it's long overdue, and it's time for regional and the international community writ large to wake up to this reality and fight to protect and promote democratic norms, to build that citizen solidarity across boundaries that Idea so eloquently was talking about. It's not too late, and I think discussions like this are really important to start pushing that forward. We just need to bring more people into the fold, more powerful people into the fold, and really make this happen before it's too late.
No, thank you very much. I fully agree. And ladies and gentlemen, and all the participants, thank you very much for this very enlightening conversation. Thanks, Hidayat and Jeff, Franklin, really appreciate it. It's very worrying times for us regarding these trends. And I think we need to put all hands on deck to figure out how to reverse it and actively do that. So appreciate it. And hopefully we'll continue conversations like this across the board to ensure that the message gets carried very far beyond where we are. So thank you very much. And please have a great afternoon, great morning, great evening, wherever you are.